are live.
Hello and welcome to Time to Write Research. This program is brought to you by Ozark Book Authority, a local nonprofit organization with the mission to improve literacy in Northwest Arkansas through fundraising, outreach, and regular literary programming. You can find out more about us at www.ozarkbookauthority.com. So we're here today with two local authors, Erin, Rowe and JC Crumpton, and I'll let them introduce themselves a little bit. Erin, what do you write, and what do you have out and about yourself, etc.?
Okay. All right. Well, I wrote a book about the food history of the Ozarks called An Ozark Culinary History, and it basically details like past to present, from late 1800s to current day, tailing of our foodways in the Ozarks, which would extend also like to Missouri and the Oklahoma Ozarks, but it's primarily focused on Arkansas. It consists of like over 150 heirloom recipes and a lot of like personal anecdotes and stories and interviews with different people around the Ozarks about their past. And I also run a company called Ozark Culinary Tours as a jumping off point from that, where I do walking food tours of our downtown areas. But the book is really the main thing and the catalyst that started it all.
Very cool. JC, what about you?
My name is JC Crumpton. I have written a book, Silence in the Garden, which is about the Crescent Hotel in Eureka Springs. I have written several stories and poems, and I have a science fiction book that is actually a science fiction mystery that will be coming out sometime next year.
What's the title of that?
Right now it's Slipping the Cradle, but my editor doesn't like it.
Oh. Fair enough.
So it may change.
Well, thank you both for joining us tonight. And Erin, drive safe, please.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me. I'm so sorry. I left Colorado a day later, so I'm on the road during this call. So if I tap out or in, just know I'll come back to you as soon as Kansas gives me a signal.
Okay. All right, so our topic tonight is writing research. You both have written work that required research to write. So we'll start with Erin. So in case you do cut out, we can get your answer in.
Sorry.
So for your cookbook / history lesson, what kind of research did you do as part of writing the book?
So I believe in like hands-on, almost ethnographic research, where you jump into the field of study and get your fingernails dirty a bit. So instead of just holding up at the library and reading a bunch of books, which I did that, I also went to the local museums and dug through shoe boxes of photographs to kind of put together the scene of, like, to almost using context clues like a detective, figure out what were the main primary ingredients of the Ozark food cuisine. And I found that the bulk of my images that I had gathered were wild game images, which told me that fish and game were like the main component of our cuisine. And I just gathered that from, the bulk of photographs available. But then I went out into the field and literally would pull over on the side of the road if I saw people selling grapes and offer to go pick grapes in their vineyard at dawn. And they didn't think I would show up, but I came in my cowboy boots and my ball cap and I was ready to go, I ran into a lady making hominy at an old folk festival in like a big like cast iron pot, and I offered to help her can it. And I don't think she thought I would show up at her house on the hottest day in August, but I did. And we canned for like 6 hours in a kitchen that had just lost its air conditioning. And you can imagine canning in that kind of heat. Like, I didn't know the lady well, but I was ready to strip down to my swimsuit. It was getting hot in there. But I think like going through the process of actually like making the food or like figuring out where it comes from and talking to the people that create or grow it or maybe people that, make wine, you kind of get more of the story than just reading about it in books. And so I believe in hitting the streets, so to speak, and searching for the story the way that a reporter would. And so that's what I did.
That's really, really cool. It's neat that like you were working on something that kind of allowed you to be able to connect with people in the community and have those experiences. I think that's great. So JC, your Silence in the Garden, it takes place at the Crescent Hotel in Eureka Springs, correct?
Yep. Yes.
So, what kind of research did you have to do for that?
Well,
Or did you?
I did lots actually. But the funny thing is, though, I first started the outline and the rough draft without doing the research, just based on what I knew about the hotel, because I went to high school in Huntsville, which is just south of Eureka Springs, and our group of friends, we all wanted to be artists or musicians or writers, and so we'd go up to Eureka, just kind of soak in the vibes and just get, take in the atmosphere. And one of our friends, his mom was actually manager of the Crescent Hotel for a while, and so we roamed that whole place looking for ghosts and everything, looking for all of the different phantasms and the paranormal that everybody told us about. And personally, we never found anything ourselves, but we would talk to employees and guests and people that say they had experienced things. And so I started writing out the outline and doing the rough draft. And then I was like, well, no, I got to go back and I got to find out what really happened. And so I went back, and the amazing thing was that a lot of what I had written down, a lot of the characters that I had created had actually been people that were there. And it was
That's
just,
kind of spooky.
it was real spooky. And I was like, going, this is really kind of, and I met different people when I started doing the research, and they're like telling me different things about, oh, well, you should have part of the story take place here because this is where, and there's a lake up there that the school would come down to on Wednesday evenings. And so that's actually a big important part of the story. And so I found that stuff out just by participating with people. And I did a lot of the writing up in the, they used to call it Doc Baker's Lounge. It's not that anymore. It's a pizza place now. But it used to be Doc Baker's Lounge. It was just a bar. And I would go up and I'd talk to the bartender, and she would sit there and she would tell me all kinds of stories and experiences that she had and that other employees had told her about. So similar to with Erin, I got to go out and be involved with the people. Now the book that's coming out next year.
That's awesome.
That was I had to learn a lot with that one because that hasn't happened. But the Crescent Hotel, the Silence in the Garden, that stuff had happened.
I think that's interesting. Like, because both of you, your stuff, it essentially takes place here. It's in Northwest Arkansas, in the Ozarks, and so you're able to reach out to those like essentially primary sources about experiences and just info that you might not otherwise be able to find. So I've done research for my work too, and none of my stuff takes place in Arkansas. So I can't really, call somebody up who lived in the 1880s in, Great Britain, because that's where my stuff takes place. So a lot of the research I had to do was, doing mechanical research, because I write the steampunk books that I wrote. There's a whole bunch of clockwork and steam machinery and stuff that I had to figure out how it actually worked so I could write about it. And so, like, I actually had more of a technical research experience. But I do have to say the value of other people's knowledge is, like, it's invaluable. One of the things that I have in one of my books is a specific pocket watch that I wanted to see if it was actually physically possible for this pocket watch to operate. So I reached out to some clockmakers in Europe who actually make a watch that has this feature. And so I was able to reach out to them and actually go back and forth and be like, so how would this work? And how would this work? And they kind of explained it to me and everything. And so like I actually got to learn from real life watchmakers how something works. And I feel like it like enriched my story. So it's like there's a lot of value to be found in other people's experiences. And I don't think it can be understated. So, but it's especially like, I write historical, so it's like I can't really get those primary sources most of the time. But when it comes to doing science, a lot of times you can get at least somebody familiar with the basic principles. So I just think it's interesting. Yeah, like both of you were able to talk to people. Yeah. But that's just neat. So sorry, tangent.
No, you were talking
So,
about science, and so my next one is science fiction mystery, and I had to do so much reading on articles and physics and rocket science, and I mean just all these different things, terraforming, atmospheric engineering, all this different sort of stuff, and it's just lots of reading, lots of research, and which gives you way to more ideas and everything.
mhm. Yeah, lots of reading for me too. Lots of, especially taking stuff in like the Victorian age, like reading about what people wear, how their clothes were made, transportation, all of these kinds of things, that we kind of take for granted. Now it's like I actually had to dig in and figure out how all of that stuff actually worked to make it come across realistically.
Talking about the past, Silence in the Garden goes back.
Something rare, like that clock.
Yeah. The Silence in the Garden goes back in the past, and I have a character in the past who smokes Lucky Strike. And everybody knows the Lucky Strike cigarettes, the red and white package. Well, back in the 20s, it was green and red.
Oh.
And so I had to put that in, and I found that out actually while I was writing it.
I didn't know that.
And so I was like, whoa, I got to put this in because somebody would catch it.
Yeah.
Somebody would say, why does he have a red and white package?
Oh yeah, definitely. I'm one of those people because I have done so much research for historical based fiction that I know a lot about really random things, and it's funny the number of times that I'll be watching something and I'll pause it and lean over to my husband and it's like, hey, did you know? Da, 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 da. And he just shakes his head and is like, okay, bro, thank you. So kind of going from there, whether it's specific or general, what was the most helpful resource for your research, whether it was for Silence in the Garden or for your new thing coming out next year? What do you find the most helpful for doing your research?
Reading, really. Reading can, and I do enjoy talking to the people, but reading actually points you in the direction that you need to go. Like for instance, on your, researching the watches, you probably did some reading and you found out who it was that you needed to go to. So the reading is really the first step. And I have read, my wife has some of the same reactions you were just talking about your husband having. And so it must be the spouses of writers just have constant eye rolling moments. It's like, do we really have to pause the movie that many times? Yeah, Chrissy doesn't even like going to the movies with me half the time because I'll be talking about it. I'll be like going, oh, actually that couldn't happen because of this and this. But no, reading is the first step, I find.
So when you do your reading, do you start like online somewhere? Do you go to a library? What resources do you actually go to in order to find what you're looking for?
Well, first I'll look online and just put in, random search words. And I don't like to be guided in my research. So I just put in random words and look for what I need. And then when I have that, will give me kind of direction. I like going down to the University of Arkansas Library because I'm Arkansas graduate. I get to go down there still and look through their libraries, because I mean you can find stuff that in that library that you don't find online. And you have this different resource of information. So the first step is online, and that usually gives me my direction where I need to go. If I need to contact somebody personally, or if I need to go to a library or go to a different source.
So, Erin, can you hear us?
I just heard the end of that question, but I didn't hear I didn't hear the end of the answer. But what was the question? I'm back on. It looks like
okay.
As soon as I get a good signal. I tried to pull over just now to fish and bait and tackle shop, and then I lost internet again. So
This will be a great setting for a new book to write.
Yeah.
I'm like way after.
So the question was, what was the most helpful resource for your research?
Okay. For me, the most helpful one was the city of Cane Hill. They all kind of chipped in together and tried to put together all the pieces for me. There were people that helped me like can the hominy, but there was also a women's group that threw a luncheon for me, and they gathered up all their old recipe cards, and all these old ladies brought their recipes to the table. And you should have seen it. It was a nut. It was a nut house because we had this lovely luncheon, but all these, it's like 5 or 7 grandmas trying to tell me at the same time all the ways that they cook biscuits. And I'm like, ladies, I can only record one voice at a time, please. And, it was hard to kind of decipher between the voices. And it was pretty funny because after I recorded all the conversation, I had to go back to my sources and go, okay, now who was it that was telling me about fried squirrel and dumplings? And who was it that was telling me about their, garden tomatoes? Because I want to get the names right with the right recipes.
Yeah.
So that was pretty fun. And I feel like people really took me on as a community member. I now to this day go back to Cane Hill and I feel like I belong there. Like it's a second home for me because those people really just adopted me as another daughter when they found out I was writing a book about the Ozarks because they care so much about it. They didn't want to lose touch with their history. And if you go to Cane Hill, it's our earliest settlement. And so because of that, the people that live there have a real appreciation for farm life, hunting, fishing, and the Ozark, the old ways of life. And so, yeah. And speaking of which, I just pulled over and I'm buying some hay bales. So that's where I'm going to stop so I can join the rest of the conversation and not get kicked out again.
Yeah.
So check out the view.
Oh, yeah. Nice. So, how did you go about finding who to go talk to? How did you figure out which towns to go to or which random grape selling stalls on the side of the road?
I know. It's
how
kind
did
of
you
crazy.
find them?
How does this begin, right? And I feel like it's the same principle you would apply in business networking, which is another thing that I do. I'm a business person. What you do is you start out with one great source, right? You start out with one. That's all you need to get to begin research. And then from there, that source, when you finish getting all the information from them that you possibly can, then you ask them, who would you recommend I talk to next? And then I'll say, oh, you think I should talk to George House, for example. I first started talking to this lady from Bentonville named Gail Brewer, who I knew from Arvest Bank, and we were good friends, but I also knew that her family had been in the Ozarks for generations. So she had me over for dinner a number of times and made the old-fashioned farm breakfast she grew up on. And then she eventually invited her Uncle George, who was a great valuable source and a much kind of older representative of the old ways. And then he would recommend someone. And so every time I got a recommendation, I would ask that person who recommended them, would you mind giving them a call or sending them an email or writing them a note telling them that I'll be contacting them? Or would you foster an introduction? And by that way, I got a lot more interviews because I not only had the name, but I had the backing of another person that believed in them and believed in me and what I was doing. So you almost are guaranteed to get an interview the next step of the way when you have a good friend that's recommending you. And then
that's really cool.
And then as far as the Tiny Town grape, stalls, I'm just crazy like that. So, girl, I was just driving back to Silo, my hometown. And if I see something that looks interesting, I'm like, just turn the car around. I'm not afraid. So, putting yourself out there is the other part. Being bold and being brave and believing in what you're doing enough that you'll pursue the story almost to the ends of the earth. I mean, not in danger, of course. I'm not going to go in some creepy guy's basement. But, I mean, JC might want to do that for some of his research. I don't know. Maybe he got some scary stuff. But for me, I tried to keep it a little bit on, the historical side. Yeah.
Right. Okay. That's really cool. Because, I was wondering about that, just how you went about actually finding all of these people and getting all of these recipes and everything. Because it seems like a really daunting thing, based on, the end product. You've got recipes just from, it seems like everybody. Yes. And so it seems like it was a lot of work to actually get all of that research done.
It definitely was, Brooke. I mean, it took me 1.5 years, but I had to quit my job to focus on the book wholeheartedly. I think if I hadn't been able to quit my job, I wouldn't have been able to attend the folk festivals and meet people during the day and have the avenues that I had available. I literally was on the road all the time. I was either writing or researching. And at one point, I realized my due date was due for the book in 12 days. and I hadn't written the book yet. So because I'd gotten
Oh
so
no.
far with the research, I was like, oh, I guess I better start writing it now. And so I narrowed down like my book to 1/4 of the amount of research I did, and skimmed off the other 75%, didn't even make the book. And I condensed it down into those 12 days, and I wrote the whole book in those 12 days.
Wow.
Yep. This girl's crazy.
Yeah.
I really find it interesting that you said you went to the Cane Hill and the older people came out to you and talked to you about the recipes and everything. I was in the past I was doing the research, and I've written the story, but I haven't sent it off. And it was a story about the about southern Madison County when they actually had a railroad down there.
Oh yeah.
And I went to the town of Pettigrew, and I was just talking to the postmaster, and it happened to be like the week before they closed that post office.
Perfect.
And it was late December, and she invited me to the Boston Mountains New Year's Eve celebration. And so I took my family, my wife and 2 kids, out in the middle of the woods, no lights. And we get out of the car, and it's fiddle and banjo music, and we're like going, whoa. So we go in, and I see the postmaster, and I start talking to her. And, I had my notebook, had my tape recorder, and it's like nobody was really talking to me or anything. And then all of a sudden this older man comes over, and he was probably the oldest one there. He comes over to me, and he goes, I hear you're writing a story. I said, yes, sir. And he goes, well, I was there when the last train came through.
Oh, wow.
So he starts talking to me. And then at that point, everybody else started talking to me. It was like as soon as he gave, it was like he was the old patriarch or something of the community. And as soon as he gave his okay, everybody just opened up. And it was just like you were just talking about, just a flood of information coming in, stuff that I will never be able to use, but it is interesting and intriguing to know and to learn.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Yeah, you're right. He almost had to be like, he was the floodgate, and then he opened it up and everyone came. Before you had his approval, it was everyone was like, well, why would we share our secrets with this guy who is this stranger, right?
Yeah.
Right.
That's
And
really
I even
cool.
found out that Madison County, Arkansas, has had houses of ill repute.
Really?
Yep.
Wow.
There was a story. One old person was telling me that the sheriff was chasing somebody, and he ran into the house of ill repute and hid under the petticoats of one of the ladies. And I'm like going, that didn't make it into the story, but I've got to come up with a story where that makes it in.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's the fun part about research.
It is.
You learn this stuff that you can actually use in other different stories later.
You do. You want to save all your research. I agree with you. Like whenever I was doing research, that 75% I didn't use. I mean, I didn't have anything as sensational as petticoat hiding, which was pretty fantastic. But if all the research I had, I saved it. I didn't just toss it in the trash. If I ever write another book, I've got enough fodder to write really 3 more. Yeah. So
when are you going to start?
I don't know, man. The thing with writing books is that, I love writing, but the writing process doesn't pay anything. And so this girl's got to make money as well and have some income coming in too. So,
well, give yourself a 12-day deadline.
There you go. That's all I need. 12 days. I could have done it on vacation just now. What was I thinking?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So to kind of follow up on that, because you kind of both have touched on this a little bit. So how did you decide how much of your research to go into your work? So like Erin, you said you basically didn't use 75% of what you actually collected. So how did you decide what to put in your book and what was left out?
Well, my process was a little bit old-fashioned, I guess. It's funny when it's your first time writing a book, you don't really know what you're going to do, right? You assume that authors have it all figured out, right? And then you figure out your own process. And what I figured out is that I am very much a literal, I need to feel the pages between my fingers kind of person. So I had all my research and I typed it down, into the computer, every little bit, like a scrappy note here, like recipe for, tomato vinaigrette, or an anecdote or story. And I put the person who said it, but I had organized them within chapters. At least I had that, right? So then I printed out each of the pages of these alleged chapters with notes in no particular order. And I spaced them between, and I cut them into little strips, the old-fashioned copy paste like you get at a printing press.
Mm-hmm.
And I just started looking at each chapter. I figured out, okay, my word count has to be this, so this is how many like about pages I need for each chapter. And then I started to cry, because then I realized I was going to have to edit out 3/4, right?
Oh,
That I had to edit that out. And my back on. Sorry.
yeah.
I realized I had to edit out 3/4. I knew that. And so I started going, okay, let's take apart all the notes from chapter 1. It's out, or chapter 2 is about corn. Okay, what items do I like the most? And I literally was just pulling, like every 4 items, I was pulling out 3 until I got it down to where it looked like visually all the words made up about, this right amount of pages. And then I just started piecing it together and putting the words in between to make a chapter, and piecing it together, the information, so it made logical, conclusive sense. So that's how I did it. And I know that's crazy, because I had scraps of paper like all through the kitchen, on the floor, on the table, like flowing like a river through the entire house, because I had to lay out visually the entire book in front of my eyes. I couldn't do it on a computer. I wasn't able to copy paste. I needed to see the scraps of paper. So I had to print out everything. Yeah.
That makes sense.
Erin, did you make every single recipe?
I made most of them. There were a couple that I did not make that I watched be made, like the squirrel meatloaf that was a championship winner for 2014. But my friends Casey Letelier and Dorothy Hall, who are fantastic people, gave me the recipe, and I did try the food to make sure it was legit. So yes. Have you tried making any of the recipes by chance? Is that why you asked? Or just
No. I was just wondering if, with all the research, and you said you were taking like chapter 2 was on corn. And you had 4, and you had to throw out 3, but did you try all 4? That's what I was wondering.
I did. And the only corn recipe that I didn't make was the moonshine, because, I didn't have all that handy, but I had it on good authority that moonshine recipe was legit.
Well, let's talk to my dad's family in Kentucky about the moonshine. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I didn't say that out loud.
Oh no! I mean, we were
no.
anyways. We met the other time,
exactly.
the moonshine.
Yes.
No big deal.
Yes.
So JC, what about you? You mentioned having, research and anecdotes and things that you collected that didn't end up in your work that you want to put into work maybe someday. But how did you decide what information ended up in your book and what didn't?
Well, in the book that I just finished, that's with the editor, that she doesn't like the title, but anyway, I had 4 of those composition notebooks, and what I would do is I would print out my articles and would paste them on each page. And so a little composition notebook is about that thick, but by the time I got done with it, it was about that thick, and I had 4 of them. And when I used something in the story, I would put a line through it.
Okay.
This is done, and I would write, where it was, what chapter, what character, what event. And when I was going through it, I realized that I hadn't used half of it.
Yeah.
So it's like I have these 4 notebooks filled with technological data that is just sitting there. It's going to be a series, so maybe I'll come back and use part of it, but I've already got research going on the next 3 books, and so those each have their own composition notebooks, filled with data. So, how do I decide which to use and which not? Whichever drives the story.
Yeah.
And if it doesn't drive the story, you can't use it. It may be one of the most fascinating technological advancements that you've ever heard of. Like one of the things that I found out was there's this gel that basically stops bullets. It takes away the kinetic energy. It's like and it doesn't transfer it to the other side like a bulletproof vest does. You still have that kinetic energy going through and damaging the body, but it just totally disintegrates the bullet and disperses the kinetic energy sideways rather than through it. And I'm like, well, that's fascinating. I can't use it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It'd be great for like a superhero, though, if you ever write, some kind of, superhero saga.
Right. Marvel get a hold of me.
Yeah, give him a call. We've got his number, Marvel. We got this. But you're right. I agree. With JC that like there are things that you don't get to include because they don't drive the story enough. Maybe they're really good, but they're just not the best, right? So you got to take the cream of your crop. And that can still be a very hard thing to let go of because maybe people spent time telling you the story or you spent a lot of time of researching that one little bit. And it's just, you have to be able, I think great writing involves a lot of letting go. And it involves taking the best. I think, what was it? Hemingway would always say you should really edit out, quite a bit of your book to make, something of true substance. So I think that JC and I are both on the right track. I mean, I would never compare myself to Hemingway in any circumstance, but I'm just saying, the process of deduction or reducing things down is a necessary evil, unfortunately. So.
Yeah. I think it's interesting hearing both of you talk about kind of like your process for deciding, because like I tend to, when I'm writing, I put everything I know into the first draft. Like if I research something, I'm like, okay, every single bit of that is going into this first draft. But then when it comes to the second draft, I'm like, okay, so yeah, this doesn't actually forward the story or the characters or anything. It's just extra fluff because I thought it was cool. So it gets cut out and I'm sad. Mm-hmm. But, it's necessary. And talking about, technical stuff, my steampunk books are very technical. The main character is an engineer. So I actually went into a lot of depth with a lot of how the machines worked and everything. But ultimately, no one really wants to read like 3 pages of technological mumbo jumbo about clockwork. So I'd have to cut that down to like a paragraph, and it's like figuring out which details are the most important and which ones like lend the most authenticity or credibility to what I'm trying to do. And it's hard. It really is, because it's like you said, you spend so much time, either collecting or talking to people or researching these things. It's like you want to share these cool things with other people. But with fiction, it's ultimately about, telling the story. And even with like your cookbook, it's you're painting a story about the Ozarks through food. And so it's like you had to figure out, how can I get the most range, from all of these things. Because it's like you could have 16 cornbread recipes.
I could.
You could.
And I think I did actually, Brooke. But yes, I know you're like, oh, geez, I don't want to hurt anybody's feelings. Oh, I know, right?
But I mean, the thing is, it's figuring out a way to represent the most amount of information in the least amount of space. Agreed. And I feel like that can be applied to both nonfiction and fiction.
Agreed.
In a way.
Yeah, and I think that really is great writing, Whenever I can read like a novella like The Great Gatsby, for example, it's so to the point on every, it's 120 pages. He wrote it in one night, which is kind of amazing. But there's not any fluff. I mean, there's not anything that's unnecessary to the story because it's shrunken down. It's just not a lot of extra pages, and I like that.
Yeah, I just remembered too. One of the things that I'm working on another novel that's a fantasy novel, and it takes place in 13th century Scotland. So it's a completely different set of research and everything. But one of the things that I spent way too much time researching was medieval bathrooms. And specifically in castles, garderobes, and how those were constructed. And I spent so much time figuring out these medieval toilets that I was like, I'm writing a page of how these work in this book for this first draft, just so I can get it out of my system, because I think it's really cool.
Yeah, it sounds fascinating.
But ultimately, when I get to the second draft, probably 95% of that is going to get cut out because it's a bathroom, right? Yeah. So it's funny because I feel like one of those things, whether it's like science fiction, especially, or like historical, I feel like, at least for me, there's a desire to want to be authentic. And so I try to get, as many accurate details as possible so that the historical part feels real, so that you buy the fantasy once I get into the magic and everything else. And I don't, it's just interesting hearing from you guys talking about you collect all this info and then decide what goes in. Whereas I'm just going to put everything in and then decide later. It's just kind of neat. It's
Well, it
not
still
so
comes
good
to
as
the same end.
Yeah.
It does. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's just how we arrive at it is a different way.
Right.
And that's what makes each writer different.
Yeah. I think it's really neat. So
Yeah.
you've kind of both touched on this a little bit. So how did you organize your research? You know, Erin, you talked about kind of collecting recipe cards
Sure.
and voice recordings and things like that. So, like, how did you go about collecting and organizing all of that before you wrote your book?
Well, for me, I had to develop the table of contents first in my head. And that was actually one of the first things I did when I presented the idea to my potential publisher. I mean, I had a lady walk into, where I was working and suggest that I buy a certain book for a museum store. And I suggested that there be another book about Ozark culinary history. She told me there wasn't one that existed. And I said, well, if you did get somebody to write it, then here's how they should structure the chapters. And here's what the first chapter should be. And I just started detailing it out before I realized mid flow, oh, I guess I could write it. And I told her. And then that's how the book contract began. Right. So in my head, the first thing that came to me was the table of contents. So whenever I thought about organizing it, it was easier for me because it was organized by type of food. And so that was helpful. So, moonshine obviously falls under corn. It wouldn't fall under, wild things or something. So that was very good. And I did have to keep excellent records though, because, I had so many interviews and so many different scraps of paper, that ended up in things. I really just had to go ahead and be diligent about entering everything into my computer as soon as I got home. If I didn't, I could lose a really good recipe or I could lose a really good story. And so I just kind of had each chapter in a separate document. So I just all I did, Brooke, was like what you did, sort of empty your brain, put it into the stuff and walk away. I didn't have to organize it yet. It just, as long as it was under each chapter heading, I felt like it was saved somewhere. And that was the main thing, is saving it in one place. It's hard when you start to save things in multiple places. Like, oh yeah, I think I have a file folder here or a computer here. Just put it all in one place, whether it's written or digital, because you're going to need to find it all at once at some point.
So did you use did you just do like Microsoft Word to kind of keep track of everything? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I did. Yeah. I'm sure there might have been even a better way, but that was the way I came up with. Again, I was just sort of winging it. Like, I was like, well, nobody's going to tell me how to do this. I'm just going to figure out my own way, so yeah. And that kind of worked for me, because then I didn't have any expectations on myself.
Mm-hmm.
When you don't have expectations, you can just totally thrive with your own wings.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was actually kind of fun to not have too much pressure on myself.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. I think if there is any way for you to relieve that kind of pressure to do things a certain way or to succeed a certain way, it's so freeing.
Yes.
Like you said, if you don't have those expectations, you can just figure it out as you go and do what works for you.
Yeah.
So, JC, you mentioned composition notebooks and even a tape recorder. So how did you organize, whether it was for Silence in the Garden or your new science fiction thing, how did you organize your research?
Like a madhouse. It is all just shoved in there. But like I said, I will write where I think it's going to go, which character, which chapter. So I may open up this composition notebook, and the first article, it says, use this in chapter 14. And then the next page will be, use this in chapter 2. But it's all organized that way, but it's all together in one, like Erin said, put it in one place. You can't be going different locations looking for everything. It's got to be in one place. And well, that's, at least I agree with Erin. That's what helps me, having it where it's easy to find.
Your system works. Yeah. So, and I like that you marked through things so you kept track of where you used it too.
Right. And I keep a bunch of composition notebooks that I do my notes and stories in. And when I have written that story or that poem and have sent it off, I put an X through it. This is done. This is stored. And then when I my rough draft, I'll do longhand.
Okay.
And then when I put it into submission form, that goes into a jump drive. So all the submissions are in one place. All my books, all my stories, my poems, newspaper articles, all that. So
Good call. That's a good move.
You're both so much more organized than I am.
well, like I said, it looks like a madhouse, though. I mean,
Well,
if I could go over and get one of my notebooks, you just see it. It's just like there is no rhyme or reason when you're going through it. You just will use this for chapter 2, or sometimes I'll just collect an article and I'll say use for a third book.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which I haven't done the outline yet, so I don't know where it's going to go in the third book. I just know it's going to go in the third book somewhere.
Yeah.
I'm exactly the same way. Yeah, and he's right. Like, it might look like a madhouse. It's like when you walk into someone's office and they have their papers all over the desk, and you're like, that looks like a mess. And they're like, yeah, but it's my mess. And I know where everything is, and it's like my own organized chaos. And that's kind of what it feels like sometimes when you're figuring it out. But I think you're right, JC. You have an outline. I do a table of contents. We start out with a structure, and then we start to fill in the gaps, you know?
Yeah. I always tell people it's a framework, and then it's like a skeleton, and then I put the flesh and the muscles, the flesh and the circulation in.
Yeah, good call.
So it's funny because you guys talk about, collecting that info and putting it somewhere. When I do research, I'm terrible. I read, like, a lot of times I'll read a bunch of books before I start working on something, like whether it's like historical or, similar books to what I'm wanting to write. And I just keep it all in my head like a crazy person, and I don't write anything down. I'm learning that's not the best method. But it's one of the things I do is I'll read a bunch of stuff, and I'm like, okay, I think I understand this well enough to write with those things in mind. And then I get to writing, and I'm like, okay, I need to look something up. So I go look it up. I figure out what it is. I put it in the book, and then I move on, and I don't write down my resources. And, yeah. So I feel like
okay. I mean,
you guys are enlightening me on, more organized methods.
I guess for fiction, you don't always have to cite your sources, which is kind of nice, right? So you could kind of invent some concepts where you wouldn't need to say where you got the information. Whereas I would have to almost cite it if I get a recipe for someone. Right. So that there might be a little bit of freedom there. So you can kind of get away with that, I suppose.
Yeah.
Now, with my science fiction, I've actually started recording the sources because I've noticed in a lot of the science fiction that's coming out today, they will put back in the acknowledgments or even in an appendix, oh, if you want to learn more about this, look at this book because this is where I got this information. I'm like going, that's a great idea. So I need to start putting that into my acknowledgement pages.
Yeah, a friend of mine writes historical-based fantasy, and she does that. She's like, I found out this info from these books and all this stuff, and I'm just like, wow. I don't even remember what books I read. So I think it's funny.
A while back, I read an article. It was about research, and it was I can't remember who wrote it, but the title was "The Rapture of Research." And the point that he was making was that, it gives your writing authenticity, especially if it's a historical piece. And I liked the fact that he was talking about, if you talk about a brand or something that happened in the past, people are going to know it and they'll be like, oh, well, that's a great point. And so I had done that in Silence in the Garden with the Lucky Strike cigarette case. And so I'm like going, well, this guy has written the Black Bart mystery series. I can't remember his name though. But some guy who's a successful series writer has recommended to do something that I have done. So I was like, that's a good thing.
All right.
Yeah.
Good deal.
Yeah, I think you're right though. Those like very specific technical details.
Yeah.
It's like, hey, I know what I'm talking about. It comes across that way. We do have a question from someone watching asking, do either of you use any apps or programs to help keep your research organized? And Erin, you talked about using Microsoft Word. How do you use it to organize your stuff?
Oh, okay. Well, yeah, because I don't really at this point use any apps, although, I wrote the book a few years ago, or like whenever I started it. I just use it like I create a new Word document for each chapter. So I'm not just putting it all in one place. So that way I won't get things mixed around.
Oh, I think we might have lost her.
She froze.
Yeah. So, JC, what about you? While we see if Erin comes back, do you have any apps or programs you use to keep organized?
Composition notebooks.
Very technologically advanced.
Yeah, it's not a whole lot. Oh, she's back. Okay.
Oh, sorry about that.
Yeah, you cut out
I
for a
haven't
little
moved, but now I'm just starting to lose a signal here in the hay bales. I don't know. But yeah, so I also use the voice recorder feature on my phone. And so that's another technology thing that I use. And sometimes it'll even write out what I hear, what I record. So that's helpful. I can copy paste that and it saves me a lot of time. But if not, then I have to type up the interview and I type it into I type up the entire interview, then I copy paste it into the appropriate chapters. I'll just basically take out pieces and copy paste them in. And so it's tedious. It is very tedious. And that's why research took the bulk of the time. But it's also slightly addicting, research can be. And certainly using apps probably would be very helpful. I don't know that there were too many writing apps when I started researching my book. And I guess I was just so like ready to go that I was like, well, I know how to use Microsoft Word, so let's get going. So that's what I use, Yeah.
Now I have used the notepad on my iPad, but actually I've just written that down to say, look up this article, look up this scientist or this research. But as far as having an app or a specific program, no, it's just writing down the notes. But otherwise than that, it's printing out or writing down the pertinent pieces that I use.
So one of the things I'm trying to be more organized. One of the things I want to work on soon is a very big, sprawling fantasy thing that is probably going to take up multiple books. And so I've been wanting to try to be more organized so that I can find this info more readily and not be like, where was that bit of info? I need to look up a little bit more about it. And one of the things that I found really helpful is Scrivener. I've been using that to divvy up kind of any research that I do is I'll paste just a link in whatever the relevant folder is. I've done that because a lot of the work I've done a little bit about like cultural research, like on cultures I might want to base one of my alt world cultures on. I'll collect info about, their history or clothing or foods and things like that. And I've actually gotten to where I'll post links. A lot of times those links are just to Wikipedia articles, but it gives me somewhere to and get more info. The other thing that I do is, Erin, you talked about using your voice recorder on your phone. I've just started using OneNote, the OneNote app, because you can sync it between your phone and your computer.
That sounds good.
And it has document, photos, and voice recording capabilities. And I haven't used it a lot, but I have used it a little bit.
I'm going to use that for my next book.
Yeah, but it's been really helpful because it does sync between my phone and my computer. So it's like if I'm out and about, not that I do that much right now, but if I come across something or think of something, I can write that down to look up later, like JC said, or, to just remember later when I need to. So.
Agreed. That sounds like a great app. I think I would definitely use that if it had been around whenever I was doing research. It would have been very cohesive to have it all in one place.
Yeah, I've had people, recommend different things to me, and nothing ever really stuck. And and a lot of time, and a lot of it, I think, is I wasn't quite the writer for it yet. 10 years ago, organizational, software. What? Who needs that? But now, now it's like my brain is so all over the place and I've got so many things in my head. I actually need to have a external place to carry all of that info.
I agree. I feel like no matter what we experience in life, we can't possibly remember it all unless we write some of it down.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and that was the whole reason for writing my book in the first place, because literally history was disappearing and it needed to be written down. But then I found that I was the same victim as these other country cooks and little ladies, that if they didn't write down the recipe, they forgot, you know, and if I didn't write down the interview, I forgot, you know.
Mm-hmm.
So the mind is fallible. It can only hold so much information. It's why you've got to use, whether you write it down digitally or by hand, you have to write it down.
I have to ask really quick. So with the recipes, did you ever run into people who had never written their recipes down?
Most of the time.
Yeah.
Actually. So most of the recipes in the book have never been ever documented in written form. So that does contradict what I just said, but a lot of these recipes have been age-old recipes that like every family member has known how to make. So for a lot of people, like the cornbread recipe, Brooke, is one of my favorites in the book, but nobody had written it down. So I literally had to measure it for the first time with the lady making it. She didn't even know what the measurements were.
Yeah.
She's like, a little bit of this. And I was like, hold the phone. Let's like grab that flour and let me actually pour it into a measuring cup for you.
Yeah.
You know? Yeah.
I was just curious because I've gotten recipes from my grandparents, you know, and my grandma's, and it's like, so how do you make this? And like, well, I don't know. I just do a little bit of this, a little bit of that. And I'm like, okay, can you write it down for me, please?
And then they write it down like that, a little bit of this. And you're like, this is not helping.
Yeah. I just stir it till it looks right.
I know. It's because people used to cook all the time, so they just got in the habit, you know. It's like second nature. You know, a lot of these old Ozark women and men didn't have recipes because they just know when the biscuits feel tacky enough that they're ready to go in the oven. They know when the soup looks like it's done. They know when that squirrel's about to turn. I mean, they know all these things.
But
What I love in recipes is like salt and pepper to taste.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
It's like, you know, like my daughter loves salt. I'll take salt in stuff, but I never add it to stuff. But so it's like if it's to taste, it depends on who's cooking or who you're
really
cooking for. Now pepper, I love pepper. My daughter does not like pepper so much.
Yeah.
So
you're right.
And I like cooking from recipes, but I never follow the recipe exactly.
I never do either, to be honest. And that's
I'm like, well, this would be good. This kind of flavor would offset this. So let's use this.
Exactly.
And you know, and it's like sometimes it hasn't turned out so well.
Yeah.
But usually it's like the more you cook, I have found the more you understand the way tastes go together.
Yeah, I totally agree, JC. I think it's a trial and error, really. You learn by experience, you know. Now with baking, that's the one exception where you have to follow the recipe, which is why I really don't enjoy baking, to be honest. It's not my favorite. I'm more of a cook than a baker.
Yeah, I see.
That's just like our research. Sorry, you wrestle with what it takes to work for you.
Yes.
And so just like a recipe, you find out what is the right mix of you know the what'd you call it, the one note or
I like the
one note or video recordings or anything like that. What works for you?
You're right. That's absolutely correct. I totally agree, JC. Good point.
Look at you with that metaphor.
Yeah, this guy's got it.
I must be a writer or something.
I guess so.
So, I guess going into our next question, we've been going for about an hour, so we kind of start to wrap up a little bit.
Sure.
But
I started driving again, and I'm getting better signal, which is weird.
Funny. So, what is the most difficult thing you've ever researched? So, Erin, what was the hardest recipe for you to get?
Well, there was this really sad story in the apple chapter about, I believe I put it in the apple chapter, or maybe I put it in canning and pickling. It could go in either one because it's about apple jelly. And it's a story that every time I read it at a book signing or a book talk, there's at least one person in the audience that cries.
Aww.
It's about the unfortunate death of this woman's family in a tornado that really happened in 1926, and about the significance of apple jelly and how her family was asking for it. And luckily she gave them and opened the last jar because that was the last apple jelly they ever had before the tornado whisked them away from her. And that's a true story. And so when I wrote that apple jelly recipe in there, I was kind of teary myself, you know?
Yeah.
Because I realized that food has memories. And so when you can attach a food memory that's kind of sad or unfortunate to an event, it really pulls at your heartstrings. And that was the hardest thing for me to write, just because I knew that for somebody out there, apple jelly meant the world.
Right.
It wasn't just something you put on toast. It represented a family that they lost.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That is really sad.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Usually, honestly, when I do a book talk, I mean, there are people that tear up, and then they're the ones buying the book. So,
Yeah.
I'm just saying, when you can reach somebody through a story, people will they'll love your book even more. It elicits an emotion in them.
An emotional connection.
Yes.
Yeah. So, JC, what about you? What was the most difficult thing you've ever researched?
Atmospheric engineering.
That sounds
my next book that's coming out next year that takes place on Venus, and they have terraformed Venus to make it more livable. And if you know Venus, it is the hottest planet in the solar system. It has the highest pressure. It is basically hell.
Did you
So
know that
how am I going to turn that to? I'm sorry.
Did you know that it rotates counterclockwise and the sun rises in the west?
Oh,
yes,
wow.
I did. One of those weird things, and one of those things that you have to get that right, or some reader is going to call you out on it.
Yeah.
But yes, making the science right to how we could terraform Venus to make it livable. I mean, I actually went and talked to some people about this one too. So it was the most difficult part of this upcoming book.
Yeah, sounds it.
Science stuff can be really difficult to do.
Also putting it in layman's terms as well.
Yes.
Right.
Translating it.
Yeah. And that's what they talk about it in the book. They're talking about the project as it starts happening, and one guy goes, "Well, how do we do it?" And one scientist starts talking about it, and the other guy goes, "No, we're going to make it rain." And the guy is like going, "Rain what? Well, rain sulfides." Oh, okay, I understand that now. And so he's like going, instead of doing all this long, formulas and different chemical reactions, the guy just says we're gonna add something to the atmosphere and make it rain sulfides.
Wow.
And so, I actually got that from someone who had worked on the theory of the project. So
yeah, that's cool.
Yeah.
So I tend to write historical based stuff, and for my steampunk stuff, the science part was actually the easy bit, because it was not futuristic in any way. It was, real applicable mechanical science. And so I could actually just get a manual and read it. It was really dry and really boring, but it was info that I could easily access.
Yes.
Whereas like the historical stuff is often much harder to get. The closer we are to the present, the easier the historical data is to find. But one of the, a lot of times the historical details are the things that are the hardest for me to figure out, figuring out how castles were built in the, 12th century in Scotland, and, where they're located, where they were located, and different things like that. A lot of times those details are really hard to track down. I really enjoy doing it because it's like a scavenger hunt. But it is really difficult. History's hard. It's fun though.
Yeah, especially when there's not a lot of documentation. You're right.
Right. Now, Silence in the Garden, deals with a lot of history, but it's like what I found, even going back to the 20s, is history is written. What piece you look at, you can actually get someone that looks at the same event, and you wouldn't think it was the same event because of the perceptions of the writers.
Yeah.
If you can find something that's like, it's almost contradictory in some instances. And I tried to think about, why, how does that make sense? And then you look at a sporting event in today's world. You have a fan of the home team and a fan of the visitor team. They're going to see that game in completely different perceptions.
You're right.
And they will record it differently.
Mm-hmm.
They will.
So, and that's the way history is as well.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to
Very good
filter
point.
through people's perceptions.
Right.
why I
Try to
think,
get
like,
the most accurate portrayal.
yeah,
Right.
primary sources are so important, I feel like, with that. I mean, yes, you may get contradictory views, but I feel like you get much more like accurate, real, like raw explanations or takes on things that happened rather than like the sanitized textbook version or Wikipedia
Yes.
version.
Yes.
I really like, because I feel like those contradictions even are like a good place of conflict, you know,
Yeah.
or it's of interest.
Yeah, certainly you
Well,
could always present both views. Whenever I
Mhm.
was researching for an Ozark Culinary History, I was looking into moonshine. I actually found a guy that used to make it and was chased by a revenuer through the woods being caught and, well, almost being caught, you know? And so I felt like his story about making moonshine and his recipe was so much more authentic than somebody looking at it from the outside.
Right.
Because he remembered exactly what it was like to work out in the woods and why he had to do what he had to do. It
Mhm.
wasn't a novelty like it is today. It was like I was poor. I needed money. I'm not proud of what I did. So please don't put my name with the recipe, but I'll give you the real recipe for moonshine and Razor Jack and peach brandy. And I was so grateful because I felt like he gave me the authentic thing from his memory
Mhm.
versus somebody going, well, I think this is how my grandpa used to make it, you know?
Right.
yeah.
That's a really cool story.
Yeah.
So to follow
Yeah.
that up,
He barely made it. Yeah.
yeah, what is the most interesting thing you've researched? JC, can you think of something?
Atmospheric engineering.
Yeah,
Exactly.
It was the hardest, but it was also the most fascinating. I
yeah.
mean, the there are so many different theories out there about how atmospheres work.
Hmm.
You know, we have this ongoing climate change issue here in our present day, and we talk about there being a 95 or 97% consensus, and that was probably just a consensus out of those scientists interviewed for that for the IPCC. Because when I did my research, there are so many varying theories out there that it's like I'm like going, there is no consensus because it's science. It's just there's so many different. That's what fascinated me about it was just that no one really knows anything,
Yeah.
Yeah.
and it's just all this. This scientist will say, "Oh, okay, well, if you look at this formula and look at this number and the way the energy readings come off of this, then you're going to understand it this way." But then you look at somebody who rebutted that same paper
Hmm.
with another paper, and they look at the same stuff, but they have a different viewpoint on it, and they put different parameters and different focus on it, and it comes out totally different. And so that's why I said it was the most fascinating as well as the most difficult to research.
That's really cool. So, Erin, what about you?
Yeah. And sometimes that can be the same. Yeah, thanks for giving me a moment to think about that one because I'm starting to backtracking through all the chapters. For me, like the wild things was the most interesting because wild things are by nature not cultivated by man, right? They're already naturally occurring in the earth. So, like, for example, learning how to track honeybees and find hives was really fascinating for me. I've never been a hunter, and I really got to learn a lot from interviewing hunters and fishermen who I totally appreciate and believe they are the greatest conservationists that we've got, and I'm so grateful for them. But in addition to that, besides hunting and fishing, I thought, well, tracking wild honeybees is quite a thing because I remember even as a second grader, I was fascinated by bees. I did a book read. That was my first ever book report as a kid. I got all my work done, so it was extra credit, and I dressed up like a bee, and I learned about drones and how hives are. But I never really learned how to find them until I talked with an old farmer,
Hmm.
and he talked to me about spitting out sugar water on a bush and then waiting for the honeybee, and the way that bees tend to spiral upwards until they reach their maximum height or altitude, and then they basically beeline, which is where that phrase comes from,
Hmm.
directly in a straight line back to the hive, which is only usually 50 to 100 yards away. And that's how you can track honeybees. You set out the bait, whether it's sugar water or just, blowing something out of your mouth, onto the bushes. And then you just follow that bee and you try not to kill yourself on the way because you're running as fast as you can to keep up with the bee. And the thing is, I just learned so much about just a simple little insect like the bee and how much they contribute to our food supply.
and it made me really appreciate that. Also, like learning how to find wild mushrooms. That is a secret that most people keep, but a lot of people were willing to share with me their secret spots or their techniques for finding things, because wild things are by nature still wild. So there's something intriguing about them that makes them infinitely more interesting to me than a cultivated plant or something that man is making. So that, to me, I think the wild things chapter and everything in it, whether it's bees or mushrooms or wild greens and how to find them, that to me made a lot of sense in my kind of innate primitive understanding of food. Yeah,
I think that it's really cool, like kind of touching on both of what you guys said is, doing research for your writing, you do it to inform your writing and to add authenticity or to add story to your actual work. But then at the same time, you're learning things.
Yeah.
It's not just for the book. It's like you're actually also enriching yourself because you're
Yes.
learning new skills or new information. And I think it's really cool. I love learning things.
I do too. Yeah. Maybe that's why we're writers, because we like learning from other writers, so we wanted to continue on the tradition.
So I just think that's really neat. It's something
now, research
research
can lead to procrastination too, though, because like we said, it's fascinating, and you start going down different rabbit holes and finding out different things and learning different ways to do things. Now, I do have a question for Erin real quick.
Oh yeah, go for it.
With the wild things, did you ever make dandelion wine? Is that really a thing?
It's really a thing, and it's delicious, and I've had it. I didn't make any, but you know what's really interesting, JC, about dandelion wine is that dandelions, I've recently discovered after the book, have one of the highest pHs out of any of the wild foods known to man. They have like a 24 pH, which to combat COVID, all you need is a 12. So I think if we could all eat some dandelion greens and drink some dandelion wine, we might be actually vaccinate or, sort of building up an immunity, if you will, to the perils of COVID. So I think that's kind of cool. So I'd recommend to everyone to get out there and gather up some dandelions, eat the leaves, and maybe, if you can find a decent recipe for dandelion wine, to go with that.
Okay. So our POA, though, doesn't like it when you have dandelions.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So kind of related to this, I have a really interesting tidbit about dandelions.
Okay. What you got?
So, the whole thing with you have with lawns and especially in neighborhoods, they're green, people don't like weeds, etc.
Right.
So that originates back to the French aristocracy. Like the whole idea of a green, perfect lawn with no weeds, because the peasants were eating dandelions and eating weeds. And that was how they were feeding themselves, as they were cultivating the land where they lived. So the French aristocrats were like, how dare you?
Really?
And so they created this perception of needing to have these perfect manicured lawns, and essentially getting rid of all of these weeds that the peasants were using as sustenance.
Wow.
And
that's incredible. If there's one more thing, to like put on the head of Marie Antoinette, we've got that now.
Yeah.
Literally on her head, but
that's how long that's been a thing. Manicured lawns goes back to the French aristocracy.
Oh my goodness. That's really interesting. Thank you, Brooke.
Yeah. I know so many random things like that.
I love this. Well, maybe you could even write a book of like interesting, fun facts. I feel like people that have amazing minds like yours that may not be able to put them into all of these different books, you could kind of, Brooke's like, book of interesting information, because it's very specialized. It'd be kind of fun to read.
So, but yeah, I wanted to add that because it was actually related.
Yes. That was great. I love it.
So as we wrap up, do you have any additional tips for writers who are researching for their own work? Any, additional resources or tips for how to find what they're looking for? JC, you want to go first?
Sure. Don't be afraid to ask questions of yourself or of anybody else you find. I have learned in my experiences that, like when I did Silence in the Garden, I couldn't be afraid to talk to anybody and everybody has something to tell you about it.
Yeah.
So that's the first thing. Everybody talks about, writers are kind of, introverts and introspective,
Yes.
but you have got to get out there and you have got to talk to people because they have the stories and they have the knowledge that you need. So don't be afraid to talk to anybody and find out anything, because you're going to get something that you can use.
Mm-hmm.
I wholeheartedly agree. Like I know that, like JC says, most writers are introverted and introspective, which I think is what makes them great writers. But you have to almost be extroverted to pursue a story, and also once you do publish your book, to promote it yourself, or else you published a book that never sells. You don't, if you're wanting to sell your book too. But yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, JC, if you weren't complete with your
that's fine.
thought. I just wanted to back you up on that.
Yeah.
So. But and Brooke, what was the question? It was like, what is just any other tips for writers, correct?
Yeah.
So obviously set a deadline. If you don't have a publisher that's giving you one, set one for yourself, because if you're like me, you will procrastinate, and not really procrastinate. I'll just keep researching until the end of time. So yeah, you set a deadline or set steps along the way, like little markers. If to you having a grand deadline is almost too intimidating, like set a thing as, maybe say, if you're a fiction writer, I want to have maybe this chapter kind of lined out by this time period, and this next chapter or this character or storyline lined out by this date. I think that's really helpful. And like JC said, don't be afraid to talk to people. You never know. Even if you think somebody doesn't have a story, they may know someone else that does. And that's what I've learned. Like, go ahead and humor people too, and take a little time to hear their story, even if you feel like it's got to not take you anywhere, because they may just give you one little fun fact that will lead you to the next big thing. I ran into that quite a bit, where I got to hear a lot of stories I didn't use, but once in a while I would get a real diamond in the rough.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think about, like, oh, sorry.
And researching should be fun.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It can be boring, though. Depends on what you're researching.
Toilets?
Yeah. Toilets were interesting, okay?
Oh, okay.
Also, it's really interesting how toilets didn't change for, like, literally thousands of years from Roman times until, like, the Victorian age. I find that fascinating. Like, I know it's toilets, but, it's interesting to me because I'm weird.
Yeah.
But so I guess that's it for our research discussion. I want to thank you guys again for agreeing to talk with me about your research for your books.
Thank you.
You kind of wonder, like, how bad was it?
Oh, yeah.
Well, we all use them, so why wouldn't we want to know about them?
Yeah. Well, it's funny because it's just like, I don't know. It's just one of those things where, like, I like to, like, look up things that, we may take for granted, or something that's, like, modern, but it's like, actually it's been around forever, but how was it around? What did it look like before now? And that stuff fascinates me. So, it's cool.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think Erin's cutting out again.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Agreed. Yeah.
She's delayed.
Yep.
Well,
the satellite's getting further away.
You guys, and it's such a.
Okay.
So Erin is somewhere
In and out. Yep.
in and out. But I wanted to thank all of our viewers for joining us for our Time to Write research. JC, if you want to tell us where to find you online and tell us about your book.
You can find me at jc-crumpton.com is my website, and you can get my book or my anthologies on Amazon.com, BarnesandNoble.com, even Walmart.com. And Silence in the Garden is about the Crescent Hotel, and goes into the past about the events that may or may not have made the ghosts that exist there.
A historical, real account of paranormal activity.
Right, and there is paranormal in there, so
Yeah.
because we bookend the past with the present, so those are the events that could take place.
So, Erin, can you tell people where to find you online and the title of your book again?
Yep.
Okay.
Absolutely. So let's hope I can stay on. Did it come through?
No.
Well, what we can do is we can add links to our video description so that people can find Erin online and find links to her book. But again, thanks again for joining us. And this program was produced by Ozark Book Authority, a local nonprofit with a mission to improve literacy in Northwest Arkansas. And you can donate to our organization at any time at www.ozarkbookauthority.com/donate to help fund events like this one. So I want to say again, thank you. And thank you, Erin, if you can hear us. And, but yeah, thanks, guys. And
thank you for having us.
Yeah. Have a good night.
All right, you too.